What if everything you've been told about success is only half the story? Behind every legend is a journey no one talks about. The failures, the sacrifices, the moments that almost broke them. From innovators to world changers to minds that shaped history, we break down what truly made them great. Because greatness isn't luck. This is Greatness Explained TV, where greatness is broken down. Subscribe and start thinking like the greats.
The laboratory is silent except for the hiss of the mercury pumps and the low murmur of gas jets casting everything in shadow. It is past midnight, October 21st, 1879, and a man sits hunched over a workbench in Menlo Park, New Jersey, staring at something so impossibly small it could be lost between his fingers. He has not slept in days. His eyes are bloodshot and swollen from staring through a microscope at glowing filaments that keep dying on him, one after another, taunting him with brief brilliance and then going dark. The financial backers are losing faith. The newspapers are calling him a fraud. The greatest scientific minds in England and Europe are publicly mocking him, betting their reputations that he will fail. 2 years of promises. Hundreds of thousands of dollars spent. 60-some failed experiments just this month alone. And now this. A carbonized thread. A piece of ordinary cotton sewing thread that has been baked in a furnace until it is black and stiff and almost weightless. Francis Gell has pumped the glass globe down to a vacuum of nearly 1 million atmospheres. Charles Batchelor has mounted the thread on its platinum clamps with the delicacy of a surgeon. The wires are connected to the generator. The whole team holds its breath, because they have been here before. They have seen the light flare and die so many times that hope itself has become a kind of punishment. He nods. The current flows. And the thread begins to glow. Not a flash. Not a burst. A glow. Soft, orange, steady. Like a sunset trapped in glass. The light holds. And holds. And holds. Batchelor leans in and says nothing, because there is nothing to say. The light is still glowing at 13 hours. It is still glowing at 13 and a half. Nobody moves. Nobody speaks. And somewhere in the room, a man who had been written off as a dreamer and a showman, a man whose own father once said the neighbors thought he was a little addled, a man who had been nearly deaf since he was 12 years old, allows himself a single word. Glorious. Now zoom out. Because that moment, that carbonized thread hanging in its glass globe in the New Jersey darkness, didn't just change Thomas Edison's life. It changed yours. Right now, wherever you are watching this, whether it is the light above your head, the screen in your hand, the refrigerator humming in the next room, the way cities burn bright against the night sky so that civilization itself seems to push back against the dark, all of it traces back to that thread, that man, that night. But here is what most people don't know about Thomas Edison. They know the legend. They know the quotes. 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration. They know the light bulb and the phonograph and the name on the history test. What they don't know is the man underneath the myth. The boy who was thrown out of school and called stupid. The wandering telegraph operator who slept on shavings and borrowed dollar bills just to eat. The inventor who was betrayed by his closest friend, nearly ruined by his own ambition, and who spent the final chapter of his career chasing a dream that even he was not sure he could reach. And by the end of this story, you are going to understand something about Edison that the textbooks never tell you. You are going to understand what it actually costs to be the person who changes the world. And I think it will change how you see your own obstacles. So if you have not subscribed to this channel yet, do it now before we go further, because this is the kind of story you are going to want to share. Before Thomas Edison could give the world electric light, the world had to be dark enough to need it. And in the 1840s, it was very dark indeed. Picture a small lake port in northern Ohio called Milan, population 1,500, sitting at the edge of the American Midwest like a smudge on a hand-drawn map. The air smells of pine sap and river mud. Freight wagons stretch back half a mile up the hillside, loaded with wheat, waiting their turn at the canal basin below. Schooners with tall masts creak against the docks. Children hang off fences to watch the new boats being launched into the Huron River. It is a working world, physical and loud and seasonal, governed by weather and muscle and the rising price of grain. Into this world on the snowy early morning of February 11, 1847, a child is born in a solid red brick house on the bluff above the canal. He is the seventh and last child of Samuel Ogden Edison, Jr., a Canadian-born lumber trader and radical thinker with a beard going gray and a lifelong habit of being on the wrong side of authority, and Nancy Elliott Edison, the daughter of two Baptist ministers, who is 41 years old, austere and steady, with gray eyes and a gift for books that she cannot stop herself passing on to this final unexpected child. They name him Thomas Alva. His siblings will call him Alva. The neighborhood children will call him, less charitably, the Edison fool. His father will say, with a kind of baffled honesty, that some folks thought he was a little addled. His teacher will send him home from school after only a few months, telling Nancy there is no use keeping the boy, he will never make a scholar. What the teacher could not see, because no one yet had the vocabulary for it, was that young Alva Edison did not think in the way that classrooms were designed to accommodate. He thought sideways and forward simultaneously. He asked questions that did not fit the lesson plan. He wanted to know not what the answer was, but why the answer worked. And when he was sitting in a schoolroom being told to memorize things he did not understand, every fiber of him was somewhere else, in the canal basin watching the physics of rope and pulley, or in the harbor watching the chemistry of sail and wind, or in his father's barn, which he once set on fire just to see, in his own words, what it would do. The fire got him a public flogging in the town square. He took it with the same unnerving calm that would unsettle people his entire life. He did not seem to understand that consequences were supposed to frighten him. When Alva was 7, Sam Edison's businesses began to unravel. The railroads came through the region and bypassed Milan's canal entirely, killing the town's commerce almost overnight. Sam loaded his family onto a small paddle boat called the Ruby and moved north to Port Huron, Michigan, a lakefront city of lumber mills and ferry crossings and the damp, cold smell of the Great Lakes in every season. He bought a big white frame house inside a defunct military reserve, built an observation tower in the back grove to earn tourist money, and tried to start over. It was here, in the cellar of that White House, that Alva Edison built his first laboratory. He was 9 years old. He filled it with 200 bottles, all labeled poison to keep anyone else from touching them. He mixed chemicals with the focused ferocity of a much older mind. He experimented until his mother worried the house would go up in smoke. And between experiments, he sat with Nancy in the sitting room and read. Not children's books. Thomas Paine, because his father insisted on it. The 6-volume History of England by David Hume. Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And then a book that cracked him open the way a lightning strike cracks an old oak and reveals what is burning inside it. It was called A School Compendium of Natural and Experimental Philosophy by a man named R.G. Parker. It covered everything from steam engines and acoustics to magnetism and the electromagnetic telegraph. It told him that electricity was an imponderable agent that pervaded the material world and was visible only in its effects. It told him that fine platinum could be drawn into a wire 50 miles long. It told him about the Torricellian vacuum, about galvanism, about the Grove battery and its sulfuric acid cells, about a man named Faraday who believed there might be an electrical relationship between the stars and the Earth. Alva read it until the cover fell off. Then he put it back together and read it again. But around the age of 12, something happened that no book could account for and that the historical record cannot fully explain. He went deaf. Not completely, not all at once, but profoundly and permanently. He would later say, with a casualness that never quite convinced anyone who heard it, that he had not heard a bird sing since he was 12 years old. Various stories circulated: a blow to the head, a scarlet fever complication, a conductor grabbing him by the ears to haul him aboard a moving train. Edison himself gave different accounts at different times, never settling on one. What he would say, with the peculiar serenity that characterized his relationship to the world's hardest facts, was that his deafness was ultimately a gift. It wrapped him in a cocoon of near silence, he said, and freed him from distraction. But you have to wonder, in those first months of deepening quiet, whether a 12-year-old boy in a lakefront town in Michigan felt it that way. Whether the silence pressed in on him at night. Whether the birds that stopped singing were a grief he never named. What we know is what he did next. He got on a train. In 1859, at 13 years old, Alva Edison became a newsboy on the Grand Trunk Railway, riding the daily run between Port Huron and Detroit and back, selling candy and fruit and newspapers and whatever else he could turn a profit on. He earned $40 to $50 a week, which was a man's wage. He gave Nancy $1 a day for room and board and invested the rest in chemistry supplies. He commandeered the front section of the baggage car and set up a mobile laboratory. He bought a second-hand printing press and taught himself to set type and launched his own onboard newspaper, the Weekly Herald, which he wrote, printed, and sold to passengers, possibly the first newspaper ever produced and distributed aboard a moving train. He also discovered, during a single April afternoon in 1862, what electricity and information could do when they moved together. The Civil War was at its most savage, and the Battle of Shiloh had just produced the most catastrophic casualty figures in American history. Standing in Detroit watching the crowds surge around newspaper bulletin boards, Alva grasped something that the editor of the Detroit Free Press had not yet fully understood. He persuaded the Grand Trunk telegraph operator, in exchange for 3 months of free magazines, to wire the battle headlines ahead to every station master on the northbound route. He bought 1,000 copies of the afternoon edition on credit. By the time his train reached the first stop, a crowd was already on the platform. He had been selling papers at 5 cents. He raised the price to 10. At the next stop he raised it to 25. By Port Huron he was shouting to the crowd, 25 cents apiece, gentlemen, I haven't got enough to go round. He sold out completely. He made, by his own account, an immense amount of money. And then, he wrote, I started the next day to learn telegraphy. The telegraph was the internet of the 19th century. It was the first technology in human history to separate communication from transportation. A message that once required a week on horseback could now arrive in seconds, as a string of dots and dashes transmitted at the speed of light down a copper wire. To understand the telegraph was to have your hands on the nervous system of the modern world. And for a boy who could barely hear, whose deafness cut him off from the normal flow of human conversation, the telegraph was a paradoxical gift. It turned language into electricity. It turned meaning into a pattern that could be felt as vibration, read from a printout, understood through the fingertips. It was, in a profound sense, a technology made for him. Alva taught himself Morse code in 4 months of 18-hour study sessions with a station master named James Mackenzie, who owed him a favor for pulling his infant son off the railroad tracks moments before a car would have killed him. He was so good, so fast, that within 3 years he was one of the most sought-after telegraph operators in the country, taking press copy at 35 to 40 words a minute, writing in a minute hand so clear it looked like printed type, able to receive messages through wires so badly corroded and storm-damaged that other operators could pull nothing coherent from the static. He also invented his first device, an automatic signal sender driven by a clock mechanism, so that when he was supposed to be awake and monitoring the line at night, a tiny ratcheted wheel would tap out the required hourly check signal while he slept. He was 16 years old. The device worked until a dispatcher arrived to investigate why Stratford Junction was perfectly regular in its signals but impossible to raise for an actual conversation. Edison fled across the border before anyone could fire him. For the next several years he became what telegraph operators called a tramp, riding the rails from town to town, taking work wherever it was offered, living in shared lodgings on bad food and borrowed money, building his skills and his knowledge and the extraordinary web of friendships that would one day become the infrastructure of his career. He worked in Adrian, Michigan, where he met a young man named Ezra Gilliland who would become one of his closest friends and, years later, one of his most painful betrayals. He worked in Indianapolis and Cincinnati and Nashville and Memphis and Louisville. He transcribed the 1,000-word presidential messages of Andrew Johnson through the grinding night hours, writing so fast and small that a card no larger than a man's palm held 647 words in print clear enough to read across a room. He read voraciously. He spent every cent he earned on books and chemical equipment. His colleagues thought he was strange. They called him Looney Edison and Victor Hugo because of his love of French novels. He did not seem to care about money or social life or the soft pleasures that most young men his age were pursuing. He cared, with a ferocity that looked from the outside like obsession and felt from the inside like the most natural thing in the world, about understanding how everything worked. Why electricity moved the way it moved. Why sound could be captured in the grooves of wire. Why information could be split and doubled and quadrupled along a single copper line. In 1868, at 21 years old, he resigned his position at Western Union in Boston, published a letter in the industry journal announcing that he was devoting his time entirely to his inventions, and stepped off the edge of the known world. He had $40. He had no laboratory. He had no backers. He had a handful of notebook sketches and a head full of ideas and an absolute refusal to accept that the world as it existed was the world as it had to be. He arrived in New York on a steamship, penniless, and spent 3 days walking the streets. He ate apple dumplings at a cheap restaurant on Washington Street and told himself he would never forget how good they tasted. Then, by pure chance, he walked into the offices of Samuel Laws's Gold Indicator Company on the day their entire transmission system broke down, and he was the only person in the room who understood how to fix it. Within 2 hours, the president of the company hired him on the spot at $100 a month. Thomas Edison was in New York, and New York was about to have no idea what hit it. The next decade was a cascade of inventions so relentless and varied that even his admirers sometimes couldn't keep track. He built the quadruplex telegraph, a system so elegant that it allowed 4 messages to travel simultaneously along a single wire, an achievement so audacious that the great William Orton of Western Union said it was an invention more wonderful than the duplex. He invented the electric pen, the first consumer product ever powered by an electric motor, which sold 60,000 units and became the grandfather of every copying machine that followed it. He invented the carbon button telephone transmitter, the device that made Alexander Graham Bell's telephone audible at more than a whisper and without which the telephone would have been a curiosity rather than a revolution. He invented the motograph, the electromotographic receiver, the translating embosser, private line telegraph systems, acoustic transfer systems, phonomotors, megaphones, and a scientific instrument called the tessimeter, which was sensitive enough to measure the infrared heat of stars. And then, in the summer of 1877, sitting in his laboratory in Menlo Park, a little factory of invention he had built in a raw field in New Jersey, he did something that stopped the world. He was experimenting with telephone transmission, trying to understand how the vibrations of sound could be captured and sent along a wire, when he noticed something. When a needle attached to a live telephone diaphragm vibrated in response to speech, it moved with extraordinary precision. It traced the exact shape of the sound wave. And if it could trace it, even once, what was to stop it from tracing it again? What was to stop it from tracing it forever? He grabbed a piece of paraffin paper and pulled it under the vibrating needle while he spoke. Then he reversed the mechanism and pulled it through again. And from the paper, faint and ghostly and unmistakable, came back his own voice. "Bachelor, if we had a point on this," Edison had said, "we could make a record on some material which we could afterward pull under the point and it would give us the speech back." He called the invention the phonograph. He described it to himself in his notebook with a single word, glorious. When he demonstrated it at the offices of Scientific American in December of 1877, the editors later wrote that he placed a little machine on their desk, turned a crank, and the machine inquired as to their health, asked how they liked the phonograph, informed them it was very well, and bid them a cordial good night. No effect of the kind had ever been produced before. A human voice, stored. A human voice, played back. The echoes of the living and the dead, made permanent. Since the dawn of humanity, every word ever spoken had dissolved into air the moment it was finished. Edison had ended that. He had turned breath into metal and metal back into breath. The newspapers called him the Wizard of Menlo Park. The French called him Le Roi de Paris. Sir William Thomson, Britain's greatest physicist, called him the first electrician of the age. He was invited to the White House. He was inducted into the highest rank of the French Legion of Honor. He was compared to Franklin and Faraday. He was the most famous person in the world. And then he turned his back on all of it and went after the light. He had been thinking about it since 1878, since a late summer trip to the workshop of a wire manufacturer named William Wallace in Connecticut, where he stood in front of a dynamo powering 8 blazing carbon arc lamps and felt his mind begin to race. Arc lamps were brutal, industrial things, too bright, too hot, too hungry for electricity, impossible to subdivide into the gentle domestic glow that a home or an office or a street could use. Every electrician in the world had told him that subdivision was impossible. The mathematics did not work. The physics did not allow it. The engineering could not be done. Edison looked at the lamps and said, "I believe I can beat you in the search." He went home and began. What followed was not a flash of genius. It was a siege. It was Edison at his most essentially and brutally himself, assembling a team of the best technical minds he could find, pouring money into equipment and supplies, testing material after material after material in a methodical, obsessive, day and night campaign against a problem that the entire scientific establishment had decided was unsolvable. He recruited Francis Upton, a Princeton mathematician who had studied under Helmholtz in Berlin. He brought in Charles Batchelor, his most trusted experimental hand. He hired Ludwig Bohm, a German glassblower trained in the finest shop in Bonn. He ordered Francis Gell to pump mercury vacuums until his arms were numb from the effort. He himself sat at the microscope for 7 hours at a stretch, watching platinum wires incandesce and die, his eyes throbbing with what he later described as the pains of hell. He tried platinum spirals, iridium, nickel, boron, silicon. He tried 500 different combinations of materials, temperatures, and vacuum levels. He made a discovery that turned the entire theory of electrical lighting upside down. The higher the resistance of the filament, the more efficient the lamp, the less copper needed in the conductors, the wider the system could extend. The professional electricians said he was wrong. Upton, trained in orthodox theory, could not at first accept it. Edison knew it the way he knew everything, not from the books, but from the work. From the endless, grinding, beautiful work. He turned to carbon. The first carbonized thread glowed for 13.5 hours. Then a split of bamboo from a Japanese grove glowed for over 1,000. Then a specific variety of Madoc bamboo from the Kansai forest of Japan, with its long siliceous fibers, burned for nearly 1,700 hours at a steady 16 candle power. By the end of 1879, Edison had 59 working lamps strung up around Menlo Park. On New Year's Eve, he invited the public to come and see. 3,000 people came. The Pennsylvania Railroad laid on extra trains. Men and women walked up the muddy boardwalk to the white laboratory on the hill and stopped when they saw it. Not the blinding glare of arc light, not the yellow flutter of gas flame, but something soft and steady and warm, like a captured piece of afternoon, hanging in a glass globe in the dark. And that was not even the hardest part. Because inventing the light bulb was only the beginning. Edison now had to invent everything else. The dynamo that would power the system. The feeder and main distribution network that would carry current through underground conduits to thousands of individual lamps. The junction boxes, the meters, the switches, the fuses, the safety systems, the lamp factory, the manufacturing operations for dynamos and conductors, and every auxiliary device the system required. He had to negotiate with the city of New York for permission to tear up the streets and bury his cables. He had to build his central station at 257 Pearl Street in Lower Manhattan and somehow keep his Wall Street backers from losing faith while the work ground forward. On September 4, 1882, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he activated the system. A square mile of Lower Manhattan, the financial district, the New York Times building, the headquarters of Drexel, Morgan, hundreds of homes and offices, blinked into incandescent light. The Times, writing the next morning under the glow of Edison's own lamps, described a soft, mellow, grateful, and beautiful light. The people who experienced it that evening, walking home through streets where lamplight fell in soft circles on the cobblestones and did not flicker, did not smell of gas, did not threaten to ignite the curtains, barely mentioned it to their families. It seemed, almost from the first moment, like something that had always been there. That is the truest measure of a transforming invention. When it becomes invisible. When the world before it becomes unimaginable. But here is the part of the story that the triumphant version leaves out. The years that followed the Pearl Street opening were not easy. They were not even close to easy. Edison spent the 1880s hemorrhaging money into his manufacturing operations, fighting the growing challenge of alternating current technology championed by George Westinghouse, and being systematically maneuvered out of control of the company that bore his name. He sank millions into an iron or mining operation in the mountains of New Jersey that he believed would make him the steel king of the eastern seaboard, and which ultimately consumed nearly $3 million and produced almost nothing. He watched the Edison General Electric Company get merged with its rivals and emerge as simply General Electric, his name erased from its title, his stake reduced to a fraction of what he had imagined it would be worth. And then, in the summer of 1884, he came home to Menlo Park to find his wife dying. Mary Stillwell Edison was 28 years old. She had been with him since he stumbled into her father's shop covered in machine oil at age 24, since the Christmas Day wedding and the Niagara Falls honeymoon and the long years of being alone in whichever house they lived in while he worked through the night. She had borne him 3 children. She had suffered from neuralgia and depression and a dependence on morphine that the family doctor and the newspaper archives both record without quite stating directly. On the morning of August 9, 1884, she died. The cause listed on her death certificate, in a space left conspicuously blank by the attending physician, was eventually described as congestion of the brain. The fuller truth went with her. Edison was alone in the house when it happened. When his daughter Marion came to him, he was shaking and sobbing and unable to speak. He grieved in the only way he knew how to grieve, by working. He threw himself into acoustic telegraphy, into a new and improved phonograph, into a collaboration with Ezra Gilliland, the old friend from his Adrian Railroad days, who had reappeared in his life at exactly the right moment of loneliness and pulled him back from the edge of something that might have been despair. For 18 months, Edison and Gilliland worked together with the closeness of brothers. Gilliland introduced him to the social world of Boston, where a 20-year-old Ohio girl named Mina Miller sat down at someone's piano and played, by Edison's own account, as badly as he had ever heard anyone play. He could not stop thinking about her. He taught her Morse code on the back of her hand at a hotel in New Hampshire and tapped out a proposal of marriage in dots and dashes against her palm, on the grounds that the message was too sacred to speak aloud. They married in February 1886. He bought her a mansion in Llewellyn Park, New Jersey, called Glenmont, with 11 acres of landscaped grounds and a mahogany staircase and rooms full of leather-tooled books left behind by an embezzler who had fled to the Caribbean. He built a new laboratory a mile down the road, 7 buildings on Valley Road in West Orange, the most sophisticated private research facility in the world. He declared himself ready to begin again. And then Gilliland betrayed him. In the summer of 1888, when Edison was negotiating the sale of his phonograph company to a Pittsburgh investor named Jesse Lippincott, it emerged that Gilliland had inserted a clause into the deal awarding himself $250,000 in cash and shares, negotiated in secret, signed by Edison's own personal attorney, executed without Edison's knowledge or consent. The man who had been his closest companion through the dark years after Mary's death, the man he had trusted without reservation, had quietly helped himself to a fortune from the transaction. Edison cabled him in London where he had gone to exhibit the phonograph. "I have this day abrogated your contract." He filed a lawsuit. He never spoke to Ezra Gilliland again. The betrayal cost him more than money. It cost him the winters in Fort Myers, Florida, where he and Gilliland had been building neighboring houses on the Caloosahatchee River, planning to share their southern retreats for the rest of their lives. For 14 years, Edison stayed away from his own Florida property rather than risk encountering his former friend. He carried the wound quietly, which was his way. He carried it into the new laboratory and the new decade, and poured it as he poured everything into the work. In 1877, he had recorded the human voice. In 1879, he had given the world electric light. In 1888, sitting in his West Orange laboratory, he called his engineer W.K.L. Dixon to his side and described a device that would do for the eye what the phonograph had done for the ear. A machine to record and reproduce the moving world itself. Dixon spent 2 years perfecting it. The result was the kinetoscope and the camera that fed it, the kinetograph, and the little dark studio they called the Black Maria, which became the first movie studio in American history. Thomas Edison invented recorded sound. He invented electric light. He invented the motion picture. Not because he was the only genius of his era, but because he refused to accept that any of these things were impossible, and because he built around himself a factory of invention, a team, a process, a relentless mechanical will that could take an idea from the notebook to the patent office to the marketplace in the time it took other men to finish arguing about whether it could be done. He lived to 84. He kept working until his body would not let him. In his final years, past 80, he launched the Edison Botanic Research Corporation and undertook what he called the most complicated problem he had ever tackled: finding a domestic plant that could produce enough natural rubber to free America from dependence on foreign supply. He tested 17,000 plant specimens. He settled, after years of patient crossbreeding and chemical extraction, on goldenrod. He was still in his laboratory at 2 a.m, still scrawling formulas in notebooks, still pushing through the walls of the possible, right up to the edge. He died on October 18, 1931. On the night of his funeral, President Herbert Hoover asked Americans to turn off their electric lights for 1 minute in tribute. The nation that he had illuminated went briefly dark, and then, as the minute ended, came blazing back. Now here is what that means for you. Today, the screen you are watching this on exists because Edison's incandescent lamp led directly to the vacuum tube, which led to the transistor, which led to the microprocessor. The electric grid that powers your home, your phone, your workplace, your city, is a direct descendant of the Pearl Street station. The concept of the recording studio, the idea that a performance can be captured and preserved and replicated indefinitely, begins with a piece of carbonized thread on a wax cylinder in Menlo Park, New Jersey. The film you watch, the music you stream, the light that makes it possible to read or work or exist past sundown, all of it in a lineage as direct as blood, comes from this one man who was told he was addled, who went deaf at 12, who slept on shavings and borrowed dollars and ate apple dumplings on the street and refused, every time the world told him to stop, to stop. 1,093 patents. That is the official count. 1,093 registered, legal, formally granted extensions of his mind into the material world. But the number that matters is something harder to count. It is the number of human hours of darkness that no longer exist. The number of nights that are not nights because of him. The number of voices that have been preserved and played back that would otherwise have dissolved into silence. He was not a perfect man. He could be cold to his children. He could be vindictive to his rivals. He manipulated the press and humiliated people who got in his way and let political considerations distort his scientific judgment in the battle between direct and alternating current. He failed, spectacularly, in the iron mines. He was cheated by people he loved and slow to admit when he was wrong and capable of jealousy and stubbornness and all the expensive human weaknesses that complicate genius without diminishing it. He was, in the end, a man who decided that the life he had been handed, the deafness, the poverty, the 3 months of formal education, the loneliness, the grief, was not a limitation but a laboratory. That every obstacle was an experiment waiting to be run. That failure was not the opposite of success but its necessary precondition, its raw material, the thing you had to produce in massive quantities before the answer finally emerged from the darkness and held. So I want to leave you with this. You are living inside Edison's invention. The light above you, the screen before you, the recorded voice in your ear, you are inside the thing he built in the dark on a night in October 1879, when everyone who doubted him had already gone home. And the question is not whether you know his name or remember his story. The question is what you are building in your dark. Because everyone has one. A problem that won't solve. A door that won't open. A thread that keeps burning out before it can become a light. Edison ran more than 10,000 experiments on his electric lamp alone. 10,000 failures before the one that worked. Not in spite of doubt, but through it. Not around the dark, but straight into it, with his hands full of the only tools he had and his stubborn, beautiful, addled mind already 1,000 experiments ahead of his body. What are you on experiment number 50 of, and telling yourself it will never work? Sit with that question. It is the one Edison would have asked you. Thank you so much for watching this story all the way to the end. If it moved you, if it challenged you, if it made you see your own obstacles differently even for a moment, Then please take a second to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't yet, because stories like this one, the lives of the people who refused to let the world stay the way it was, are what we do here every single time. And I want to know, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your city, your country, wherever you are right now in the comments below. These stories are for all of us, everywhere the light reaches.